Israelin konflikti. Sionismi on 1800-luvulla syntynyt juutalaisten kansallinen liike, jonka tärkeimpänä tavoitteena oli luoda juutalaisille oma valtio. Sionistisen liikkeen perusti Theodor Herzl, joka vuonna 1896 esitti sionismin perusperiaatteet kirjassaan Juutalaisvaltio ja järjesti maailman ensimmäisen sionistisen kongressin Sveitsissä vuonna 1897. Juutalaisten kotimaaksi suunniteltiin Palestiinan ohella myös Argentiinaa ja Ugandaa, mutta vuoden 1906 sionistikongressi määritteli juutalaisten kotimaaksi Palestiinan. Sionismissa juutalaisilla on oikeus oman valtion perustamiseen Palestiinan alueella.
What is Iran's regime's current position in relation to Israel?
The Iranians believe that Israel does not have moral legitimacy as an apartheid regime. And the only way that it can gain legitimacy is that if apartheid is cast aside, if ethno-supremacism is cast aside, if racial and religious discrimination in the sense that Muslims and Christians are lesser human beings and they don't have any right to the land that they've been on for hundreds of years, that should be set aside. People who have been expelled have the right of return. It's not very complicated. It's not, as you say, rocket science.
Valtavat usean aallon juutalaisten muuttoliikkeet Palestiinaan alkoivat. Viidennessä aallossa 1930-luvulla muutti Palestiinaan kerralla jopa 250 000 juutalaista. Kun juutalaisia oli vuonna 1881 Palestiinassa noin 25 000, heidän lukumääränsä toisen maailmansodan jälkeen vuonna 1947 oli jo 630 000. Arabeja-alueella oli noin 1,3 miljoonaa. Levottomuudet alueella kasvoivat juutalaisten massamaahanmuuton sekä juutalaisvaltion perustamissuunnitelmien johdosta. Kuinkahan suomalaiset reagoisivat, jos tänne muuttaisi muutamassa vuodessa vaikkapa 1 miljoona muslimia? Yhdistyneiden kansakuntien yleiskokous hyväksyi 29. marraskuuta 1947 päätöslauselman 181, joka sisälsi esityksen Palestiinan jakamisesta arabi- ja juutalaisvaltioihin.
The Jewish National Fund was established by the World Zionist Organization in order to acquire land, and wealthy Jews of Europe donated money which went to purchase Arab land in Palestine. By 1947, about 7% of all the land of Palestine had been purchased by Jews, but most of the land was owned by Palestinians. This created a situation in 1947 when the UN acquired the mandate of Palestine and had to come up with a solution for the problem of these two nations that were, in a sense, or two peoples that were vying for a nation of Palestine. And we arrive at that point where 7% of the land is owned by the Yishuv, the Jewish community, and about 1/3 of the population is Jewish. The UN decided to give about 54% of the land of Palestine to the Jewish community. This created outrage amongst the Palestinians. No Palestinian leader was able to accept this deal. This deal looked terribly one-sided. 54% of the land going to people who owned only 7% of it. And again, the majority of land going to 1/3 of the population.
Tämä johti sisällissotaan brittijoukkoja ja juutalaisia vastaan. Juutalaiset ryhmittyivät puolustautumaan, mutta siirtyivät keväällä 1948 myös hyökkäämään. Brittien poistettua alueelta Israelin valtio perustettiin vuonna 1948 ja sisällissota laajeni, kun Egyptin, Syyrian, Jordanian, Libanonin ja Irakin armeijat hyökkäsivät Israeliin itsenäisyysjulistusta seuranneena päivänä. Sota päättyi 7. tammikuuta 1949 Israelin täydelliseen voittoon. Kuunnellaanpa, mitä israelilainen historioitsija Ilan Pape kertoo vuoden 1948 tapahtumista.
The United Nations. In February 1947, the United Nations appointed the United Nations Special Committee of Palestine, UNSCOP, with 13 member states who knew very little about Palestine, and most of them have never been there before. Maybe this is one of the reasons that they totally misunderstood either the Palestinian position of the United Nations involvement or the general the Arab League position on the Palestine question. All around the Arab world, there were mandatory countries such as Iraq, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, waiting for their independence that was supposed to come through a democratic vote by the people living in those countries to decide the future and character of the liberated new Arab state. Only in Palestine, the very idea that the Palestinians would decide what is the future of Palestine was not accepted by the United Nations. Instead, it suggested that the settler movement of Zionism, most of these settlers came just a few years before to Palestine, that they would have the right to participate in negotiation over the future of Palestine. And even before the United Nations adopted its resolution 181 through the General Assembly on the 29th of November 1947, even before that resolution that gave the settler colonial movement of Zionism more than half of the country, even before that, the Palestinians demanded from the United Nations a far longer process of negotiation so as to explain to them why their rights of self-determination are being denied by the international organization. The American delegation, one should say, in February 1948 suggested 5-year trusteeship over Palestine, which was accepted by the Palestinians, in order to give the additional 5 years for negotiating a far more just idea for the future of Palestine. However, under pressure of the Jewish lobby in the United States, President Truman withdrew the American support for the trusteeship trusteeship agreement. In February 1948, the forces of the Jewish community in Palestine began, regardless of what was happening here in the United Nations, began a process that I called in my book in 2007 of ethnically cleansing the Palestinians. In April 1948, most of the Palestinian population that lived in Palestinian towns, or the mixed Arab-Jewish towns of Palestine, were expelled or forced to leave. And we are talking about more than 150,000 Palestinians who lived in the urban space of Palestine, who became refugees even before the British Mandate of Palestine on the 15th of May ended. These expulsions from the city were accelerated by acts of massacres, the most known of them, the massacre of Deir Yassin on April the 9th, 1948. So even before the Arab League decided to send military forces in order to try and save the Palestinians on May the 15th, 1948, 250,000 Palestinians were already refugees. And the presence of these refugees in the Arab world forced the Arab governments to do something, although most of them were quite reluctant to participate in any kind of military adventure in Palestine. While the Israeli forces, we should call them now the Israeli forces after the establishment of the State of Israel on May the 15th, 1948, while the Israeli forces were fighting against these contingents from the Arab world, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine continued. The Palestinian villages in the middle of Palestine, in the south, in the north, were overexposed to a tactic that was already articulated by the Jewish forces in a plan that was adopted on the 10th of March 1948. The plan described exactly how the Palestinian villages should be encircled, forced to leave, or evicted by force should this flight not happen. The worst chapter in the Nakba came in October 1948 during the operation that the Israelis called the Hiram operation in the north of Galilee. Even some of the leaders of the Jewish community themselves wrote in their diaries that what the Israelis did in October 1948 was not very different from what the Nazis did in the Second World War. This operation was the toughest because the Palestinians already knew what awaited them, and they were putting a tough resistance, which had led to a list of war crimes and atrocities that completed the ethnic cleansing in Palestine. So within 9 months, half of Palestine's population was expelled, half of Palestine's villages were demolished, and most of the Palestinian towns were wiped out. The Israelis already in August 1948 began an operation that I call memoricide, in order to wipe out any residue and remnant of the Palestinian existence in Palestine. They built Jewish colonies and settlements over the destroyed Palestinian villages, quite often giving them a Hebrew name, that resembled the Arab name of the village. Thus, Safuria became Tzipori, Lubia became Lavi, and so on. The idea was to say that these were actually ancient biblical places, and therefore this was not a destruction of village, but rather the redemption and the return to the villages. On other villages, the Israeli planted forests. The Israelis imported 10,000 pine trees from Europe to cover the Palestinian villages that were destroyed in the catastrophe of 48. I can tell you, as a second generation of European settler, that we don't do well in the climate of the Middle East, and the same happened to the pine trees of Israel. Many of them became very ill, and where they died, the old orchards and olive trees came back to claim their presence on the land that used to be Palestine and Arab.
Yhdistyneiden kansakuntien ja brittien arvion mukaan noin 700–750 000, eli runsas puolet Palestiinan 1,3 miljoonan arabiasukkaasta pakeni tai karkotettiin. Kansainväliset vaatimukset pakolaisten paluun sallimiselle johtivat vuonna 1948 Yhdistyneiden kansakuntien päätöslauselmaan 194, jonka mukaan Israelista karkotetut ja paenneet piti päästää palaamaan entisille asuinsijoilleen, ja heiltä ryöstetty omaisuus piti palauttaa tai korvata. Paluuoikeus tuli antaa niille pakolaisille, jotka haluavat elää rauhassa naapureidensa kanssa. Israel ei ole kuitenkaan suostunut koskaan noudattamaan päätöslauselmaa muilta osin kuin että se oli kesällä 1949 valmis ottamaan vastaan 70 000 pakolaista. Vuoteen 1951 mennessä Israel oli kuitenkin ottanut maahan noin 700 000 siirtolaista, mikä kaksinkertaisti juutalaisen väestön määrän. Useita sotia on alueesta vielä käyty tämänkin jälkeen, mutta Israel on onnistunut voittamaan. YK:n yleiskokouksen päätöslauselma 3379 hyväksyttiin 10. marraskuuta 1975 äänin 72–35. Siinä määriteltiin sionismi rasismin ja rodullisen syrjinnän muodoksi. Päätöslauselma kuitenkin peruutettiin 16. joulukuuta 1991 päätöksellä 46/86. Monet israelilaiset uskovat, että sionistit pyrkivät rauhanomaiseen rinnakkaiseloon, mutta palestiinalaiset kieltäytyivät ja kieltäytyvät yhä. Heidän mielestään sotien aikana saadut maat ovat oikeutetusti heidän, ja palestiinalaisten paluun estäminen on tarpeen. Muuria pidetään välttämättömänä turvallisuuden vuoksi, suojana terrorismilta. Israelilaiset näkevät tämän itsepuolustuksena, eivät rasistisena tai etnisenä suvaitsemattomuutena. Mutta onko heillä riittävää oikeudellista perustetta edes olla Palestiinassa? Konfliktin ongelmat ovat selvästi alkaneet juutalaisen sionismin synnystä, massamaahanmuuton ja juutalaisvaltion perustamisen seurauksena. Voidaanko puhua rauhanomaisesta rinnakkaiselosta samalla, kun mennään toiseen valtioon pyrkimyksenään integraation sijaan perustaa oma valtio ja maahanmuuton avulla syrjäyttää hallitsevan kansan enemmistövalta? Mielestäni ongelmaa ei voida ratkaista tunnustamatta vuoden 1948 tapahtumia ja siksi jätän loppupuheenvuoron Ilan Papeelle.
Let me conclude by saying that I think that any peace process that ignores what happened in 1948, and the peace process so far had totally ignored what happened in 1948, would have at least to rely on three principles, which I call the 3 A's. A for acknowledgement. It's quite amazing how even the top negotiators in the world who deal with Palestine do not acknowledge the catastrophe of 1948. The second is accountability. Acknowledged by itself is useless, as we know, in post-apartheid South Africa. And the only way to make Israel accountable for the ethnic cleansing of 1948, which is a crime against humanity, is to allow the unconditional implementation of Resolution 194 of the United Nations General Secretary, how do you call it? General Assembly, thank you, Riyadh. General Assembly resolution sanctioning the unconditional return of the Palestinian refugees to their homeland. And the last A is acceptance. I think that once there is acknowledgement and once there is accountability, not only for the crimes of 48, but for the ongoing crimes since 1948, then the Israelis can ask both the Palestinians and the Arab world to accept them as an organic part of Palestine, of the Arab world, of the Middle East, and be part of its problems and its solutions. Thank you.